I saw with my own eyes the exploitation that bled our continent dry, the echo of centuries of plunder. But the day came when African patience ran out. Side by side with a brother in arms, we raised our voices, and in an instant, the pen of sovereignty cut the chains of 50 mining licenses. This is our story, the story of Africa rising up. If you feel this flame of justice and believe in the power of African self-determination, subscribe to the channel now. Your voice amplifies ours. I, IBRAHIM TRAORE, felt the clamor of every African land, not only that of my Burkina Faso, but that of Guinea, Niger, and every sister nation that pulsed under the same sun. In my ears resounded the silent lament of a vast and invaluable continent that for decades had been treated as a mere repository of resources, its riches extracted without compassion, leaving behind a trail of poverty that contrasted brutally with the opulence of those who benefited from it, a cruel paradox that consumed me. I saw the same scars on the landscape, the same empty promises echoing in the communities, and this reality forced me to a profound understanding of the injustice that was perpetuated, generating in me an urgency for radical and urgent change. I watched with a heavy heart as foreign companies, with their voracious machines and predatory contracts, drilled into the earth's crust of Guinea, extracting mountains of bauxite, glittering gold, sparkling diamonds and valuable iron, exporting fortunes while leaving behind only desolate craters and empty promises, entire villages without basic sanitation, hospitals or decent schools, transforming the natural wealth into a pit of misery for those who inhabited the ancestral land. I saw this plundering from afar, but I felt its weight in my soul, because the pain of one African brother is the pain of all of us, and the wealth taken from Guinea was the wealth of all Africa, disappearing in ships to distant lands, a silent but devastating theft. The environmental devastation was an open wound that I could not ignore, with rivers murky and polluted, forests deforested, and the land, which had once been fertile and generous, now barren and corroded by the incessant search for profit, leaving an indelible scar on the soul of the continent and the spirit of its people. And this rampant irresponsibility only fueled my growing certainty that change was not only necessary, but imperative and urgent. I breathed the same dusty air, saw the same degradation in the eyes of my elders, and to me, it was a crime against nature and against future generations, a legacy of greed that needed to be confronted with the force of unshakable conviction. I heard, and felt deeply in each report, the voices of the Guinean communities, so similar to those of my own people, tired of the promises that echoed in the void, of the agreements that crumbled to dust, and of the hope that faded with each new dawn, while the promised prosperity remained a distant mirage on the desolate horizon, perpetuating a vicious cycle of dependence and frustration that seemed endless. For me, each unfulfilled word was a betrayal, a demonstration of disregard for the dignity of the African people, and I knew that this disillusionment was a silent fuel for the revolt that, sooner or later, would explode in a unanimous cry for justice and self-determination. But despite the oppression that was spreading across Africa, a sense of discontent was beginning to brew quietly in the villages and towns, turning into murmurs of resistance, a latent yearning for dignity and authentic sovereignty, a burning desire to regain control over their own destiny and the priceless wealth of their ancestral lands, and I felt this growing energy. It was an effervescence that welled up from the depths of the African soul, manifesting itself in defiant looks, in whispered conversations that spread like wildfire, and in an unbreakable resilience that refused to be subdued by economic tyranny, and I knew that this quiet force was the seed of a coming revolution. Yet the resilience of the African spirit was unshakable, a quiet and powerful force that manifested itself in the ability to smile in the face of adversity, to find beauty in struggle, and to cherish hope for a future where justice would prevail, where the land would flourish again for its rightful heirs, and I witnessed this intrinsic dignity, this unshakable faith that persisted even in the face of the most severe deprivation. It was an inspiration to me, a constant reminder that our strength lay not only in our resources, but in the indomitable will of a people who refused to be broken, standing firm, rooted in their traditions and their sense of community, even when the world conspired to dispossess them. The bauxite, the backbone of the Guinean economy, was being shipped on gigantic ships that disappeared over the horizon, carrying with them not only minerals but also the promise of a better future for millions of people who continued to live on the margins of development, while the wealth generated by their own resources enriched distant lands. Every ton of gold, every rough diamond that crossed the borders, represented to me a slice of sovereignty that was being stolen, a piece of potential that was being diverted, perpetuating a cycle of dependence that seemed impossible to break, but that needed to be confronted with urgency and determination. This cruel paradox, of a continent rich in resources with poor people, was the truth that drove me to action. It was clear that a new generation of thinkers and activists was emerging, young people with sharp minds and hearts inflamed with passion for their continent, who were beginning to openly question the status quo and demanding a fundamental rethinking of the economic relationships that kept Africa subjugated to outside interests. And I saw in their eyes the same spark that burned in me, the same righteous indignation. I felt that I was not alone in this struggle, that my convictions resonated with many others, and that together, we could form a powerful and undeniable chorus. They were not content with the old narratives of aid that masked exploitation. They sought real economic liberation, genuine self-determination. My own impatience grew with each passing day, becoming an unquenchable flame that drove me to seek a solution to this complex equation of wealth and poverty, of power and submission, with the certainty that Africa needed courageous leaders who had the audacity to challenge established paradigms, to break the invisible chains that bound it to a past of exploitation. I felt that the moment was ripe, that the patience of the African people had reached its limit, and that history was calling for an act of sovereignty that would resonate throughout the continent, echoing the need for a radical and irreversible change that would return control to those who truly held the rights over the land. So the atmosphere was charged with anticipation, like a sky before an impending storm, and I knew that the continent was waiting anxiously for a sign, for a leader who would not just speak to the needs of his people, but who had the courage to act, to take control of his own destiny and rewrite the narrative of exploitation into an epic of self-determination and freedom. And I could feel the energy in the air. A mix of hope and tension. For me, it was only a matter of time until the pieces fell into place, until the voice of sovereignty rose up and proclaimed its undeniable presence. The stage was set for a historic transformation, and I knew I was about to be a part of something big. I watched with a restrained but profound satisfaction as the old guard, the one that had for so long knelt at the feet of foreign interests, began to be swept away by a rising tide of popular discontent that was sweeping across Africa, and which gave way to a new generation of leaders who, driven by a nationalist fervor and a deep love for their land, emerged from the military ranks. With the promise of a sovereignty that seemed forgotten, and with the audacity to challenge the power structures that kept the continent trapped in an endless cycle of exploitation and submission. I felt this change of wind in every fiber of my being, because this was the voice that the people had been crying out for decades, and finally, it was being heard and acted upon by men of courage who were not afraid to dismantle the status quo. In my own Burkina Faso, I felt the urgency coming from the streets, the exasperation of a people yearning for dignity and control over their own destiny, and I myself was driven by this overwhelming force to take the reins of a country crumbling under the weight of inefficiency and corruption. Transforming myself not into a mere leader but into a catalyst for a revolution that sought to restore sovereignty and hope to a nation. My rise was a direct reflection of the burning desire of a people who refused to be subjugated, and I knew that my mission was not just to govern, but to be the voice of a nation crying out for its freedom, for its right to own its wealth and its future. At the same time, I watched with great interest and growing admiration the rise of Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya in Guinea, a man who, although coming from the military, carried with him the weight of the experience of seeing his people suffer under the yoke of economic injustice, and who presented himself not as a mere substitute for the previous power, but as the personification of a break with the past. An echo of the voice of the Guinean people calling for genuine change and true self-determination. I followed his first steps, the way he quickly captured the imagination of an exhausted nation by promising an administration that would truly serve Guinean interests, and not the dictates of distant capitals, and I realized that his determination was as ironclad as my own. In our initial speeches and actions I discerned a profound alignment, a symbiosis of ideals that transcended the geographical boundaries that separated us, where both Doumbouya and I articulated visions that were not just of national liberation, but of a renewed Pan-Africanism, a cry for a united and autonomous Africa, free from the neocolonial shackles that had for so long stifled its development and true expression. I felt the strength of this conviction, the truth in their words, for we were not talking just about politics, but about a profound reconnection with African identity, with the need to be the true masters of our own destiny, and this filled me with a nearly forgotten hope, a certainty that we were not alone. The conversations behind the scenes, the whispers that circulated in the corridors of power and on the vibrant streets of the capitals, began to solidify the idea of an unprecedented alliance between our nations, not just of mutual support in times of crisis, but of a strategic and symbolic collaboration that aimed to send an unequivocal message to the world. Africa was waking up, and its leaders were ready to defend its interests with a ferocity never seen before, and I knew that this union was not the result of chance. I saw the growing interconnection between our purposes, the way in which our visions complemented and strengthened each other, and I understood that it was the inevitability of a historical necessity that called for a unified front against the forces of domination. The regional context was a boiling cauldron of tensions and aspirations, where other countries in the region were also beginning to question their relations with former colonial powers, and where anti-imperialist sentiment was gaining ground every day, transforming the continent into an epicenter of a new era of self-determination, far from the passivity that characterized past decades. I felt this wave of empowerment, a collective awakening that was spreading like wildfire. For me, the courage that Colonel Doumbouya and I displayed was not isolated, but rather the tip of an iceberg of a much larger transformation, a global movement of nations claiming their rights and autonomy in an increasingly multipolar international scenario. Actions such as the cancellation of military agreements and the reassessment of economic partnerships with other African nations served as precedent and inspiration, signaling that the time of unquestioning submission was over, and that economic sovereignty would become the next battleground, a fertile ground for the assertion of African dignity in the face of external exploitation. And I saw that the boldness of these leaders was not seen as an insane risk, but as an inevitability, a necessary step to ensure that Africa's riches would benefit the African people first, and that the narrative of dependency would finally be dispelled, paving the way for a new era of prosperity and self-determination. The seed of courage was being planted in fertile soil, ready to germinate and flourish. The people, for the most part, supported this radical turnaround because the pain of exploitation was palpable in their daily lives, and the promise of control over their own natural resources resonated deeply with an age-old desire for dignity and justice, validating the actions of their leaders as an echo of their own deepest aspirations. I heard the murmurs of approval in the streets, felt the renewed hope in the eyes of those who had previously been resigned, and for me, this intrinsic connection between the people and their leaders was the true force behind any revolution, a popular mandate that legitimized the boldest actions, transforming them into an act of true representation. This was the voice of a nation that, united, was finally finding its strength. The strategy began to take shape, a bold and unprecedented strategy that would involve not just a review of contracts but a clean break with the predatory practices of the past, a reckoning that would reverberate across the globe, sending a clear message that complacency and unbridled exploitation would no longer be tolerated on African soil. I could feel the tension and anticipation growing, the certainty that mere diplomacy was no longer enough, that only decisive action, an act of unquestionable courage, could break the chains that had for so long stifled the continent's potential, and I knew that they were preparing a move that would shake the foundations of global power. The moment of truth was approaching, and the air was charged with an almost palpable electricity. The idea of a massive cancellation of foreign mining licenses, a drastic and unprecedented measure, emerged not as a revenge but as a moral and economic imperative, a declaration of undeniable sovereignty aimed at protecting the riches of the earth for future generations, and redefining the rules of the game in a continent that had long been treated as a mere supplier of raw materials. I understood that this was not a frivolous decision, but an act of deep reflection and supreme courage, born of the certainty that the time for passivity was over, and that Africa was ready to take its rightful place on the world stage. as master of its own destiny and guardian of its own riches. The future of Guinea, and by extension of the entire continent, depended on this powerful act of self-determination. As I felt the tension building, an almost palpable electricity that preceded an event of historic magnitude, as news of my impending visit to Guinea to meet with President Mamadi Doumbouya began to circulate through the corridors of power and the vibrant streets of Conakry, raising anticipation to a fever pitch. For me, this convergence of leaders was not just a diplomatic encounter, but a harbinger of a bold declaration that would resonate across the African continent and far beyond. It was as if two rivers, each with its own current of resilience and determination, were about to join together in a mighty rush, generating a force that would defy the gravity of the old orders, and I knew that this moment would be remembered for centuries. The world was about to witness an unprecedented act of African solidarity, and I felt the responsibility of this union in every nerve. Despite the relentless pressures and warnings, sometimes veiled, sometimes explicit, emanating from Western capitals and transnational corporations, President Doumbouya and I remained steadfast in our determination to forge an alliance that would not be at the mercy of external interests, but rather focused exclusively on the sovereignty and well-being of our own peoples. A testament to our courage and our shared vision that could not be compromised. I felt the strength in their eyes, the conviction that permeated each of their gestures, and I realized that we were prepared to face the repercussions of our choices, because we knew that authentic freedom could not be negotiated or sold, but rather conquered with the audacity of an indomitable spirit that refused to bow down. Threats and pressures only served to strengthen the resolve that burned in our hearts. I watched my own arrival in Conakry, feeling the energy of the crowd that welcomed me with a mixture of euphoria and reverence, because I was not just a visiting head of state, but a symbol of a new era of African dignity, a reflection of the will of a continent that refused to be treated as a mere appendage of global interests, and I felt the weight of this symbolism reverberate in every applause and every chant. The cries of, "Long live Africa!" and "Our sovereignty!" echoed through the streets, and for me, it was a chorus that perfectly translated the message that would be delivered to the world, a reminder that the voice of the people was the driving force behind every decision we would make, and that the union of our wills was rooted in a just and undeniable cause. In the days following my arrival, I felt the urgency and gravity of the discussions that were taking place behind closed doors, where President Doumbouya and I, along with our advisors and experts, pored over complex data, predatory contracts, and legal briefs, preparing the arguments and legal basis for the impending decision to cancel the mining licenses, ensuring that each step was strategically calculated and unassailable in the face of any future challenge. I imagined the impact of each word, how we would align our strategies, strengthening each other against possible retaliation, and I knew that every detail was being meticulously planned to ensure that Africa emerged victorious from this historic battle, with truth as our greatest weapon. Communication between us, the two leaders, was fluid and intense, a constant flow of ideas and support, reinforcing our mutual conviction that collective action was the most effective way to challenge the economic powers that had exploited the continent for so long, and that this union was not just a symbolic gesture, but a vital strategic partnership for the achievement of our common goals. A beacon of hope for all of Africa. I saw the admiration in our eyes, a camaraderie forged in the furnace of responsibility and leadership, and this gave me the certainty that the strength of this alliance was not only political, but also personal, based on mutual respect and a shared vision that would propel us toward a future of autonomy. The official announcement of the decision to cancel the 50 foreign mining licenses was made at a joint press conference, a breathtaking moment that I, and the entire world, witnessed with a mixture of amazement and admiration, because it was not just a simple declaration, but a thunderclap that echoed across continents, signaling a new era of empowerment and self-determination for Africa. I felt the gravity of that moment, the way in which the words spoken by President Doumbouya, and endorsed by me, carried the weight of centuries of injustice and the hope of a more just future, an announcement that was at once a rallying cry and a hymn to sovereignty. And I knew that the cameras were recording the moment, but the impact would reverberate for generations. President Doumbouya's voice, firm and resonant, declared that the decision was a non-negotiable act of sovereignty, a direct response to the predatory practices and failure to honor agreements by foreign companies that for years had extracted the wealth of the land without offering the promised benefits to the Guinean people in return, leaving them in poverty. I listened to every word, and each one was a blow against complacency and exploitation, a call for global responsibility, and I felt the truth in his words, the righteous indignation that arose from the reality of his people, and for me, he was not only defending his nation, but also paving the way for other African nations to follow his example. Guinea's dignity was being restored block by block, and I was proud to be by his side. Then, with my own passionate oratory, I reinforced Doumbouya's message, stressing the importance of solidarity among African nations in the fight against neocolonialism and economic exploitation, and proclaiming that Africa's time as a mere supplier of cheap raw materials was over, and that the continent was finally ready to claim its rightful place on the global stage, as an equal and sovereign partner. I felt the strength of my own voice, the power of my conviction, and for me, I was not just supporting an ally, but co-signing a manifesto of African liberation, a commitment that Africa would never again be exploited on its own soil. The flame of Pan-Africanism burned brighter than ever, illuminating the way forward, and I felt that our legacy was being forged at that very moment. The immediate reaction of the international media and global markets was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fury, with alarmist headlines and apocalyptic predictions about Guinea's economic future, while the affected companies threatened legal retaliation and economic sanctions, trying to discredit the action as a thoughtless and irresponsible act. I watched the chaos and hypocrisy, the way those who had long benefited from exploitation were now outraged by the mere claim of sovereignty, and I knew that these reactions were merely a reflection of the fear of losing control over Africa's wealth, a sign that the decision had struck at the heart of the neocolonial system. The truth was uncomfortable for those who thrived on lies, and their fury was proof of our moral victory. But the resonance in the hearts of Africans, and those who advocated for global justice, was overwhelming and inspiring, with millions of people celebrating the courage of us two leaders, seeing in our actions a beacon of hope and a watershed that would redefine relations between Africa and the rest of the world, ushering in a new era of equity and mutual respect. I felt the joy and hope that spread like a wave across the continent, and for me, the decision to cancel the permits was not just about economics, but about dignity, about restoring the self-esteem of a continent that had for so long been humiliated, and I knew that this was only the first battle in a larger war for true freedom and self-determination for our African people. I watched with a mixture of apprehension and determination as shockwaves spread across the global scene following the bold announcement that President Doumbouya and I made together, and the reaction of Western powers was as predictable as it was fierce, with diplomats expressing deep concern, and financial analysts warning of a supposed economic collapse in Guinea and, by extension, in our own Burkina Faso. While the affected corporations mobilized their armies of lobbyists and lawyers, preparing a massive counteroffensive to reverse the decision that challenged their power. I felt the hypocrisy in every statement, the fabricated indignation of those who saw their billion-dollar profits threatened, and for me, this reaction only confirmed the wisdom of the decision we had taken, because the anger of the exploiters was the greatest proof that Africa had finally struck where it hurt most, at the heart of its exploitation. The threats, as I had expected, quickly turned into tangible actions, and the economic pressure was immediate and suffocating, with sharp falls in the stock markets impacting our partners, dire warnings from international risk agencies that tried to discredit our stability, and even suggestions of sanctions by some nations that felt wronged by African audacity. All of this orchestrated to isolate Guinea and Burkina Faso, and to sow panic among our allies, in a desperate attempt to force a retreat from the sovereignty decision. I saw how the global financial system, which for so long benefited from the unpunished exploitation of our resources, showed its most cruel face, using its influence to try to strangle our emerging economies. But President Doumbouya and I refused to give up an inch of our position, showing the world that dignity and self-determination were worth more than any financial pressure, no matter how intense. The narrative war erupted with overwhelming intensity, and the Western media, for the most part, plunged headlong into an unprecedented campaign of disinformation and smear, painting me and President Doumbouya as unpredictable despots, and our African nations as unstable and incapable of managing their own resources responsibly. All in order to justify continued exploitation and to undermine the global public's confidence in Africa's ability to govern itself with integrity and competence. I watched every biased headline, every biased and distorted report, and felt the frustration of seeing the truth manipulated to serve vested interests. But I also realized that this disinformation campaign was a sign of desperation, an attempt to control perception before the truth of African self-determination could spread freely, showing everyone that the truth, on its own, stood on its own 2 feet and could not be silenced. Internally, the challenges were immense, and I sensed the apprehension of some sectors of society, both in Guinea and Burkina Faso, who feared the short-term economic repercussions of our boldness, and the need to maintain national unity under this external pressure became a top priority for us, the leaders, who needed not only to defend our decision with solid arguments, but also to assure the people that the long-term benefits, true prosperity and dignity, would outweigh the immediate difficulties, requiring transparent communication and firm leadership that would inspire confidence and keep hope alive. I saw the worried looks of some citizens, but also the unwavering faith of the majority, and I knew that the true test of our leadership would come not only in making the decision, but in the ability to sustain the momentum and navigate the turbulent waters that lay ahead, keeping our nations united around a common goal of sovereignty and future, without wavering. Yet Mamadi Doumbouya's resilience and my own were an inspiring force for our people and for the continent, and we refused to waver in the face of the most intense pressure the Western world could bring to bear, turning every threat into an opportunity to reassert our sovereignty and strengthen the unity of our people, demonstrating an unwavering courage that echoed the cry for justice that I felt pulsing across Africa. I saw in our eyes the determination forged in adversity, the unshakable conviction that we were doing the right thing, and this steadfastness inspired not only our own citizens but also observers around the world who yearned for an example of leadership that would not bow to the economic tyranny that was plaguing many countries. We were the pillars of a new Africa, and I felt the strength of our united stance. Global solidarity was not long in coming, and I watched with hope as nations in the global south, and even some progressive voices in the west, rose up in support of the decision by Guinea and Burkina Faso, recognizing the sovereign right of each nation to control its own natural resources and to define its own path of development, transforming the dispute into a symbol of the broader struggle for a more just and equitable global system, where equity was the rule and not the exception. I saw the support of other African leaders who sent us messages of encouragement, of fearless activists, and of international organizations who understood the historic importance of this moment, and for me, this wave of solidarity was irrefutable proof that Africa was not alone in its journey, but that it was part of a global movement for self-determination and justice that was gaining momentum every day. The practical challenges of taking over mining operations previously managed by multinationals with decades of experience were monumental, and I understood the complexity of replacing the expertise and technology of foreign companies, which would require massive investment in training our own technicians, robust infrastructure and efficient management, a Herculean task that we, the leaders, were determined to undertake, confident that the long-term benefit to our people would outweigh any upfront costs and sacrifices. I knew that the transition would not be easy, that there would be complex technical and operational hurdles to overcome, but I also saw the clear vision that Africa had the talent and resources to manage its own wealth, and that this was an essential step to ensure that the profits remained on the continent, directly benefiting our people, not foreign powers. The promise to reinvest mining profits directly into local communities, to build decent schools, well-equipped hospitals, basic infrastructure and sustainable social development programs, was the foundation of the vision that President Doumbouya and I shared, a tangible way to show the people that economic sovereignty was not just an abstract concept or an empty political promise, but a reality that would translate into concrete improvements in their daily lives, restoring their faith in a more prosperous and dignified future. I felt the emotion of this promise materialize in every project that was initiated, the justice in every word that was spoken, because that was the true essence of the struggle, not just to regain control, but to ensure that the wealth of the land served the well-being of its people, correcting centuries of inequality and exploitation. The long-term vision that President Doumbouya and I cultivated went far beyond simply canceling the licenses. It extended to a future where Guinea and Burkina Faso would be models of autonomous development in Africa, diversifying their economies so as to no longer depend on the export of a single commodity. Industrializing its natural resources with its own technology and building complete value chains that would create jobs and prosperity for future generations, definitively breaking with the extractive model imposed by neocolonialism. I saw the magnitude of this dream, the audacity of this ambition in each of our conversations, and for me, this was the true revolution, transforming Africa from a mere supplier of raw materials into a center of innovation and production, ensuring that its destiny was forged by the hands of its own people, with its own resources and its own sovereign vision. The determination of both presidents to forge ahead despite all the adversities and incessant external pressures was an undeniable testament to our unshakable faith in the justice of our cause and in the capacity of our peoples to forge a path of self-determination, solidifying the message that African sovereignty was no longer a distant aspiration or an unattainable ideal, but a tangible reality that was being built, step by step, with unwavering courage and conviction. I felt that we were not only making history, but rewriting Africa's future, challenging the world to recognize the dignity and right of a continent to be master of its own destiny, and I knew that this act of bravery would echo throughout time, inspiring millions to strive for a more just and equitable world, starting on our own sacred soil. I witnessed the stunned silence that followed the initial fury of foreign powers, a momentary pause in the orchestra of global criticism that tried to silence us, and this vacuum was soon filled by the resonance of a new melody, that of respect, albeit reticent, as the world began to assimilate the magnitude and irreversibility of the bold action that Guinea and my Burkina Faso had undertaken. Understanding that Africa was no longer a passive stage for the power games of others, but a protagonist determined to write its own script, and I felt that this was a historic turning point, a point of no return in the trajectory of our continent. The balance of power, however much they tried to deny it and resist it, was beginning to move, slowly but inexorably, toward a more just and equitable balance, and I knew we had been the catalyst. The impact on our neighboring African nations was immediate and inspiring, and I watched with admiration as leaders and peoples of other countries, previously hesitant to challenge the status quo exploration, began to openly discuss the revision of their own mining contracts and the renegotiation of partnerships with foreign powers, fueled by the courage that President Doumbouya and I demonstrated, serving as a beacon for self-determination that lit a flame of hope and empowerment that spread like an unstoppable wildfire across the continent. I felt this wave of inspiration, this growing certainty that Africa was coming together in a common purpose, and for me, this solidarity was the very essence of Pan-Africanism reborn, a collective strength that refused to be subjugated by anyone, showing that together we were unbreakable. Internally, the vision that President Doumbouya and I shared began to translate into concrete actions on Guinean soil, and I saw the beginning of an ambitious process of restructuring the mining industry, with the creation of new Guinean state-owned companies and the accelerated training of local engineers and technicians, a colossal effort to take full control of the exploration and processing of minerals, ensuring that the added value of the land's wealth remained on African soil and directly benefited its people. I saw the complexity of the task, the mountain of technical and administrative challenges, but also the unwavering determination to build an industry that served national interests, generating decent jobs and local knowledge. For me, this was true economic liberation, the materialization of a dream of autonomy and prosperity for future generations that would come after us. Profits that had previously been diverted to foreign corporations and distant shareholders began to be reinvested directly in essential social programs and vital infrastructure, and I saw the first seeds of a visible and tangible transformation. New schools filled with children eager for knowledge were being built in remote villages, well-equipped hospitals were springing up in previously impoverished areas. Roads were connecting isolated communities, and sanitation systems were dramatically improving the quality of life, all financed by Guinea's own wealth, a tangible testament to the fact that economic sovereignty was not just empty rhetoric but a promise that was being realized in dignity and renewed hope for the people. I felt the joy and relief of the people, the way hope was blossoming in their eyes, because the wealth of the land was finally returning to its rightful place, back into the hands of the Guinean people. The international scene, in turn, was forced to adjust to this new and irrefutable reality, and I watched with interest as some global powers, realizing that the old approach of unilateral exploitation would no longer be tolerated on African soil, began to seek new forms of partnership with Guinea and other African nations that followed their example, based on fairer and more equitable terms. With mutual respect and the promised transfer of technology, recognizing that the era of unilateral exploitation had come to an end and that Africa was ready to negotiate on equal terms, as a sovereign and respected partner. I saw the first diplomatic moves, the attempt to readjust global strategies, and for me, this was irrefutable proof that the courage of Mamadi Doumbouya and myself had forced a profound global reassessment, proving that dignity and sovereignty are non-negotiable values that, once asserted with determination, changed the game forever. The vision of industrialization and economic diversification, once a distant and almost utopian dream, began to take shape with concrete projects to process bauxite into aluminum within Guinea itself, and to create complete value chains for gold and diamonds, generating far more jobs and wealth than the simple export of raw materials, transforming the nation from a mere supplier to a producer of added value. And I felt the energy of this transformation, the promise of a future where Africa would not only extract, but also create, innovate and prosper based on its own intelligence and workforce, controlling its own industrial and technological destiny, a giant step towards true economic independence and the construction of a solid foundation for the prosperity of its peoples for many generations. It is true that challenges would remain, and I knew that the road ahead would not be without obstacles, continued pressures and severe tests of resilience, but the foundation had been laid, a solid foundation of self-determination and control over one's own resources, and the invaluable lesson that unity and courage can overcome decades of exploitation had been indelibly etched into history, becoming an immortal legacy for all future generations of Africans and advocates of justice in the world. I felt that the journey was far from over, but the direction was clear and unshakable, and the faith in Africa's potential to forge its own path, without asking permission from anyone, would never again be shaken, because the seed of freedom had been planted deep, and was now blossoming in fertile soil, watered by the courage of our people. The bold act that President Doumbouya and I took together became an indelible milestone in the history of Africa, an epic of resistance that resonates with the soul of a continent that refuses to be subjugated by external powers, and I felt privileged to have witnessed and actively participated in this transformative moment, to have seen Africa rise up and claim its inalienable right to be master of itself, its sacred land and its own destiny, without any external intervention. For me, this was not just news that impacted financial markets, but a revelation, concrete proof that justice, when pursued with unwavering courage and sincere unity, can truly move mountains, rewriting narratives that have oppressed us for centuries and inspiring a new chapter of prosperity and dignity for millions of people who have for so long been silenced by limitless exploitation. I have watched as the world, accustomed to seeing Africa as a continent of endless crises and chronic dependencies, has been forced to reevaluate its deep-rooted perceptions, to confront its own historical prejudices, and to finally recognize that Africa's true strength lies in its innate capacity for self-determination, its unwavering resilience in the face of adversity, and the courage of its leaders who, by uniting their voices and their actions, have demonstrated to the planet that sovereignty is not a privilege granted, but a fundamental and inalienable right that must be defended at all costs. And I, IBRAHIM TRAORE, who felt the cry of the earth and the unwavering desire of a people thirsting for justice, understood that I was witnessing not just the cancellation of mining licenses, but the inauguration of a new era, a new and glorious dawn for Africa that was rising with dignity, with renewed purpose, and with the certainty of its own power. And so, as the story unfolds under the African sun, I feel inseparable from this epic journey, a messenger of a powerful truth that needs to be told again and again, the truth that Africa, with its inestimable resources and indomitable spirit, is forging its own destiny with its own hands, inspiring the entire world with the courage of its leaders and the unwavering resilience of its people. And I know that the legacy of these acts of sovereignty will continue to echo for generations, a timeless reminder that dignity and freedom are values that are always worth fighting for and that, once won, can never be surrendered again. The story of true African freedom is only just beginning, and I am here to tell every chapter, until the end. If this story touched you, if it awakened in your heart the flame of justice and sovereignty that burns within us, I ask you to join this cause. Subscribe to the channel right now, like this video so that this message of self-determination and courage reaches and inspires even more people around the world, and comment below on what you felt when you heard this story. Your presence and your engagement are the fuel that allows us to continue bringing stories of transformation and a more just future for Africa and the planet. Let's build this new era together.